Hello guys, welcome back. So we have to talk about what is going on with the economy right now. A lot of things have happened in the past 3 months. Brent crude is still hovering between $108 to $118 a barrel. It is up 60% since late February. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. 20% of global oil flows are blocked, and they have been blocked since the war has started. And we are now entering month 3 of the war. And this is now going to lead to a global supply chain disruption. And it's a pretty big macro setup that's expected to hit the Western economy. As an investor, I see recessions as an opportunity. Like we all know, opportunities wait for no one. If you're new here and you want to hear more from me regularly about market updates and personal finance, then make sure you join my newsletter down in the description box below. I also created a free personal finance tracker to help you manage your budget, which I will leave the link to in the description box as well. So the best way to handle risk is not to avoid it, but it is to understand it. And when you don't understand risk and opportunity properly, it can feel scary and it can feel like gambling. So that's why people say, oh, if I put $1,000 into the stock market, that could be zero tomorrow. It's because they don't really understand the asset that they are investing in, nor do they understand the risk that they're taking. But when you understand the asset, when you understand the risk involved, then it feels like a calculated decision. So how do we understand the risk of a market crash? The answer is that we study history, because history is the best predictor of the future. So market crashes are not rare events. Market crashes have happened in my lifetime. They've happened in your lifetime. They've happened in your mom, your dad, your grandma, your grandpa's lifetime. They are normal events. Since 1928, in total, the S&P 500 has had 26 bear markets, and bull markets have happened 27 times. So statistically, you actually spend a lot of your time investing either in a bear market, recovering from one, or about to enter one. So if we look at some of the actual statistics, the average frequency between bear markets is usually every 5 years. And the average length is just under 300 days. Whereas the average bull market, it takes a lot longer for markets to go up than do to go down. Average bull market is just under 1,000 days. So every single time a bear market has happened in history, a bull market has followed after it. Okay, so the stock market goes up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, but it just keeps going up, right? And so the market spends most of their time in bull markets. So the good news is that the bleeding doesn't last very long, but it also means that the opportunity to seize that period also doesn't last very long. Again, if we take a look at the biggest market crashes in history, the key is that the market always ends up recovering. Might not be tomorrow, might not be a year from now, but it always recovers at some point or another. That's why panic selling always leads to lost money. In fact, if we take a look at the statistics, 42% of the S&P 500's strongest days in the last 20 years actually happened during a bear market. So Warren Buffett, in one of his letters to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders back in 1986, he had this very famous quote where he said, "Occasional outbreaks of those two super contagious diseases, fear and greed, will forever occur in the investment community. The timing of these epidemics will be unpredictable. Therefore, we never try to anticipate the arrival or the departure of either disease. Our goal is more modest. We simply attempt to be fearful when others are greedy and to be greedy only when others are fearful." Very, very famous quote. Charlie Munger, who passed away in 2023, was Warren Buffett's sidekick, and his famous quote was about the waiting, where he said, "The big money is not in the buying or the selling, but in the waiting. And it takes character to sit with all that cash and to do nothing. I didn't get to the top where I'm going after mediocre opportunities." In a typical investing lifetime, let's say that you start when you're 25 and you stop investing when you're 75, that's like 50 years of being invested in the markets. You will go through probably between 5 to 7 real economic downturns, real recessions, and probably at least 10 bear markets. Economists, who are really, really smart people, they try really, really hard to predict precisely when these things will happen, but they are more often wrong as they are right. And that's why there's this famous quote that we can never time the market. But having said that, there are still economic indicators that do flash before downturns happen. And right now, there are indications that a few of them are happening. So big question that people might have is, are we in a recession yet? Technically, how economists define a recession is that we need to have 2 quarters of negative GDP. So technically right now we are not in a recession because GDP is not negative. But because it takes 2 quarters of negative GDP to actually happen before we can call it a recession, economists prefer to be proactive and look at recession indicators so that we're not waiting 6 to 12 months after it already happened to have called a recession. If we take a look at some of these numbers in Q1, which did include 1 month of the war, GDP was 2%. And that was a pretty big rebound from Q4 of 2025, where it was only at 0.5%, but there are some reasons why there was such a sharp incline. One of the reasons being that there was a government shutdown. If you guys remember, at the end of last year, there was also some defense-related spending for the war that happened in Q1 that also propped up the economy as well. So if we take out those normalizing events, then actual GDP would have been less than 2%. Personal consumption is 1.6%, and business investment is 10.4%, but that was almost entirely AI CapEx spending. So the US economy is not contracting right now. We are technically not in a recession, but a lot of economists and a lot of analysts are using the phrase stagflation, or at least stagflation-Lite. Not as bad as it was in the 70s. There's just a lot of talk right now that the AI CapEx spending is literally propping up the entire economy right now. So we're not in recession yet, but it takes 2 quarters of data to actually officially declare a recession. So to be proactive, let's take a look at some risks that a recession is coming up, or risks that we could be heading into a recession. The main one is oil. So Brent crude right now is trading between $108 to $118 as of early May. And that is roughly 60% up from where it was when the war started. For context, Brent crude started the year at $63. And the reason why oil is so important is because high oil is a very, very high indicator of recession risk. A lot of post-World War II recessions actually had an oil shock right before, because oil affects everything. It affects all of our daily lives, starting at the gas prices that you pay at the pump. But then it also affects commercial as well. Diesel, fuel, airplanes, airlines, plastics, boats, ships, fertilizer, and food. So that's why when oil goes up, it directly leads to inflation. And when inflation goes up, then the Fed has to make a decision. What are they going to do with interest rates? Because the Fed has a dual mandate of controlling inflation, or trying to target inflation at 2% while also maximizing employment. Let's talk about stagflation a little bit. So the textbook definition of stagflation is when the economy is contracting with inflation, which is what we're experiencing right now, and also rising unemployment. Right now, the labor market isn't actually looking too good. Jerome Powell addressed this in last week's FOMC meeting. And then the stagnant growth risk, which is being challenged right now by high oil prices. All of the economists heading into 2026 were already using the phrase stagflation-Lite. This is before the war even started, so arguably it's getting even worse now. If we take a look at some very specific numbers, the Q1 PCE inflation print was 2.9% in Q4, up to 4.5% in Q1. Core PCE went from 2.7% to 4.3%. So that's not inflation easing at all. And the full effect, again, of the war hasn't even hit yet. The next biggest inflation risk, probably just as important as oil prices, is interest rates. So when the FOMC had their meeting last week on April 29th, they decided to hold rates.
Today, the FOMC decided to leave our policy rate unchanged. We see the current stance of monetary policy as appropriate to promote progress toward our maximum employment and 2% inflation goals.
So the Fed funds rate right now is being held steady at 3.5 to 3.75. That was Jerome Powell's last meeting as the chair. And why this matters to us as investors is because a few things. Heading into 2026, the narrative was that the equity market was pricing in an assumption of multiple rate cuts this year. Some of the premium valuations that we're seeing right now, including the S&P at 21 times forward earnings and the Mag 7 trading at what they currently trade at, some of that is based on the assumption that the Fed is supposed to keep easing at interest rates. Kevin Warsh, who is going to replace Jerome Powell and is expected to be confirmed by the Senate before the next FOMC meeting in June, has historically known to be a hawk when it comes to interest rates because of his political history. One thing he has publicly said about AI is that he expects it to be a significant disflationary force because of this productivity thesis that AI is expected to bring us, right? The idea that with AI, every knowledge worker can now produce 5, 10, 15 times as much as just a single person. So the counter argument here is that the productivity gains that society gets from AI will actually allow the Fed to ease interest rates without resparking or triggering inflation. This is all very hypothetical right now. Of course, it's all based on the assumption that AI is going to play out the way that we have been told that it's going to play out. If Brent crude stays above $100 and the Q2 inflation print comes out really hot, then there's a very high likelihood that Kevin Warsh is going to have to not just hold rates, but also maybe even raise rates. So as an investor, you and I know that any company can be an outstanding business, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be an outstanding investment. It's only a good investment if you're paying the right price for it. If an investor is willing to pay 50 times forward earnings for a stock, then that investor is basically betting on perfect execution. But markets don't stay perfect forever, right? So elevated multiples in themselves is not what causes a market crash. But the thing is that it increases the likelihood that there will be a crash if earnings or guidance get cut and they disappoint. So a lot of these AI companies right now that are trading at very high multiples, the management teams are also somewhat pressured to match the expectations that investors have. So they will keep pushing up aggressive or semi-aggressive guidance to basically support the stock price. Investors are actually starting to get a little bit worried about AI CapEx spending. Meta released their earnings last week and they actually beat earnings with flying colors, but management or Mark Zuckerberg announced that they're expecting CapEx spending to actually go up higher than what they had initially projected. And because of that, a lot of investors pulled out just because they are nervous about all of this AI CapEx spending. All of this comes down to this cumulative expectation that everyone wants to see actual money and dollars and margin expansion coming to these Mag 7 companies in the next year to year and a half. So let's talk about some actionable strategies that you can take to actually take advantage of a recession. The first is to hold cash, which is what Charlie Munger loves to talk about. Cash leads to optionality. And who doesn't want optionality? When the dip actually comes, you can't buy what you don't hold in cash. I personally always hold cash. I don't get FOMO. I don't get scared of my cash deflating. Hey, if Warren Buffett can sit on $300 billion of cash and not be worried about his cash deflating at 2% a year, I think that I will be okay if I hold a little bit of cash too. The reason why investors like Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett are not afraid of holding cash is because they know that the potential benefit and the potential upside of getting into the stock market at really attractive valuations is going to far exceed any money they lose from their $300 billion cash pile deflating at 1 or 2% a year. The second is dollar cost averaging. So the whole idea around dollar cost averaging is that it's basically impossible to time the market. If you think about all of the factors that I talked about before and how there's all these different economists out there that try to study and try to read the economy, they try to come up with these like predictions. Economists, they do a ton of research to try to come up with predictions, to try to come up with like the best information possible on what's going to happen to the market, right? But the reality is that, and we all know this, is you can't really time the market. So you can hold some cash and have that always available to you to seize opportunities, but also dollar cost average in the meantime as well. So a combination of holding cash and also DCAing consistently is basically how you protect yourself as an investor, but also allow you to seize opportunities when they actually come. The third strategy is my personal favorite strategy, and that is to sell your cost base. So let's say that you bought a stock for $10,000 3 years ago, and that stock is now $15,000. If you're worried about what might happen in the market, what you can do is you can sell off your original cost base of $10,000 and basically just play with profits. Playing with profits is a great way of basically managing your own risk and managing your own capital, because worst case scenario, you only can lose what you've already made money on, which you can kind of see as free money, if you will. If we ignore inflation and opportunity costs and all that stuff, then that $5,000 is basically like free money, right? So this is one way of managing risk as an investor. The fourth strategy is one that I rarely hear people talk about. This is a strategy that I used personally during the 2020 crash that allowed me to basically almost triple my money in a very short amount of time. When an actual recession or a crash happens and it gets really bad, there's a general rule of thumb to follow when you're looking at individual equities. So the general rule of thumb is going for three things, and you guys can look these up if you want further context on what these actually mean. But the first is a conservative balance sheet. The second is a net cash position, meaning that they have more cash than debt. And the third is positive free cash flow growth, because companies that have this financial profile do not go bankrupt in recessions. No matter how bad the recessions are, there's a very high likelihood that these companies will not go bankrupt. These are usually the companies that will be the ones that are acquiring or saving the companies that do go bankrupt. When a recession happens, fundamentals are what save a business, right? So companies that will not pass or survive a recession are usually ones that are extremely leveraged. Consumer discretionary is very fickle and it tends to be hurt the most and hurt the quickest when people are not doing well, okay? So for example, when times are bad, people don't buy as many shoes or clothes as they normally do. If a recession did hit, I would personally never invest in a company, no matter what the stock price is, that is not unprofitable, that does not have free cash, a company that is very leveraged or has a lot of speculative grade debt on their books. So if buying individual stocks isn't your thing, which is totally normal, then you can look into broad market index funds like VOO, VTI, QQQ, or any of the other really popular alternatives that have low management fees. Vanguard's expense ratio on VOO is 0.03%. And so that basically allows investors to own America's top 500 companies at a very, very, very low cost. Then the last strategy is investing in sector index ETFs. So if you don't like individual stocks and you want some diversification beyond index funds, then sector ETFs. Sector ETFs basically allow you to get that exposure to the industry without single stock risk. So if you really believe in AI infrastructure, but you don't want to take a concentrated bet on which hyperscaler is going to win, then you can look into a semiconductor sector ETF. If you want to have exposure to energy, XLE or XOP. So I will leave some of the main sector index ETFs on screen here. So some of my clients ask me about real estate as well on top of stocks. If you want to know what I think about real estate, which is a slightly different conversation than this one, because real estate heavily depends on the strategy that you have with the property itself, whether you are buying, hold, renting it out, or doing a fix and flip, and it also depends on location as well. Real estate is a little bit different than stocks, so make sure you check out my video up top there if you want to know how I think about the current real estate market and where I think the opportunities are. Video up top there. That's all for this one, guys. Make sure you hit the thumbs up button, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Till next time.